I know I have to keep my volume up so that everybody can hear. I'm not a historian, but the first major contribution of Chinese in the United States was building the Transcontinental Railroad. The second major contribution was from the Chinese American veterans of World War II and their opening up of opportunities for all Chinese and Asian Americans to be a part of mainstream America. My thrust tonight is to honor and recognize both Chinese railroad workers and Chinese American veterans of World War II. And for those of you in the younger generation, I want to give you a vision and outlook to strive toward. I'd like to use some poetic license on the meaning of a story arc and tell you 3 story arcs. Number 1, the story arc of my father. Number 2, the story arc of Chinese railroad workers. And number 3, the story arc of Chinese American World War II veterans. First, the story arc of my father. Now, I can't be here in Detroit and Michigan without telling the story about my father and his association with Detroit and Michigan. And of course, by Michigan, I mean the University of Michigan. Do we have any alumni out there? Go blue.
Go green.
Now, my father was born in Columbus, Ohio. So he was a Buckeye by birth. But he was Michigan all the way. He was orphaned at age 15, and he had to work his way through high school and university. He started in Michigan in 1928 and graduated in 1932 with a degree in aeronautical engineering. Now, to support himself through college, every Friday after class, he would take a Greyhound bus from Ann Arbor and come to Detroit, work in a Chinese restaurant over the weekend, and Sunday afternoon, catch a bus to go back to Ann Arbor. Now, this was during the Depression. And it's so hard for us today to imagine how he survived during that Depression period, let alone graduate in 4 years. My father repeatedly said that the first major impact on his life was his education at Michigan. Not just the academics, but learning from his contemporaries and his classmates. In particular, as a Chinese American, it was at Michigan for the first time that he really got to know Chinese students from China. He befriended them, they befriended him, resulting in lifelong relationships. He joined a fraternity there at the time, the FF fraternity, and we have a table here tonight made up of members of the FF fraternity from Ann Arbor, and in particular a descendant, Andrew Lyons, whose father was at Michigan at the same time as my father. So thank you for coming. My father's story arc is that he worked his way through college, but couldn't find a job in aeronautical engineering when he graduated. Because, number 1, it was the Depression. Number 2, aircraft companies were not hiring Orientals at that time. And I use the term Orientals, which we don't really hear about much today. And even though he was an ABC, and in those days they didn't know and they didn't use the term ABC, American-born Chinese, he still couldn't get a job in an aircraft company. But he had a passion for aviation. He saved enough money to take flying lessons in New York, got his commercial pilot's license, and went to China in 1935 to fly for an airline. Getting his pilot's license was the second major impact in his life, because with that skill, it gave him confidence. Flying above the clouds, confidence in those dark days of the Depression. After Pearl Harbor, he joined the U.S. Army Air Force as a pilot and worked for General Claire Chennault of the legendary Flying Tigers. That was the third major impact in his career, because he worked for General Chennault as Chennault's personal representative and liaison officer to the Chinese Air Force in Chongqing, and later, after the war, my father continued working for General Chennault for the airline that Chennault founded after the war. So my father's story arc involved being not hireable during the Depression by aircraft companies, but after an aviation career as an airline pilot, military pilot, and airline executive, the situation changed. So when an aircraft company, Northrop Aircraft Company, had the need, they sought out his skills and experience and hired him. So, how is all this related to Chinese railroad workers and World War II veterans? Quite simply, my father's father was a Chinese railroad worker on the Southern Pacific Railroad that went from California to El Paso, Texas. And when they finished at El Paso, the workers were released. They scattered. Some went back to China, some went back to California. My father wound up in the grocery business in Mississippi, but because of racial tensions, they moved north, and so my father was born then as a Buckeye. So he is an example of a descendant experiencing struggles just like the railroad workers, but he carried on the legacy of progress started by Chinese railroad workers. Now, to the story arc of the Chinese railroad workers. The story arc of the Chinese railroad workers is that they built the Transcontinental Railroad from west to east. About 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad workers were Chinese. They endured hard labor, sacrifice, risk of life, and they blasted tunnels, laid grade, and carved footholds through the rugged Sierra Mountains. And this was during the harsh winter, and then to the hot Utah desert until they reached Promontory Summit. They faced prejudice, discrimination, and physical abuse, and they had longer hours than other railroad workers while being paid 30 to 50% lower wages. Progress was slow in the recognition of the Chinese railroad workers. They were ignored, forgotten, snubbed, and almost written out of history. Now, you have all probably seen that iconic photo of the joining of the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad. And that was on May 10th, 1869 at Promontory Summit. It's etched into history, where not a single Chinese railroad worker can be visibly seen in that photo. However, the latest research by Stanford University indicates that perhaps one man with his back turned may have been a Chinese railroad worker. Now, there was a period of time in the 1970s when Chinese railroad workers were singled out for their hard work and efficiency as they worked on other railroads and other construction projects. However, that was short-lived because the efficiency and their total lower cost soon grew into resentment. Resentment of the Chinese laborers so much that the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. Over 5 years ago, at the 145th anniversary, the Department of Labor finally recognized the Chinese railroad worker and inducted the Chinese railroad worker into their Hall of Honor. But at the 100th anniversary, on May 10th, 1969, the Secretary of Transportation spoke, and he had endless words that only Americans could build 10 miles of track a day. Only Americans could bore through the granite of the Sierra Mountains. Yet it was the Chinese workers that did that, and the Secretary of the Transportation did not at all mention Chinese railroad workers. On that same day, a Chinese-American leader from San Francisco was scheduled to speak, but he got scratched and snubbed from the agenda. So my words on that day of May 10th, 1969, could be that it was a day of infamy for Chinese Americans. Now, I was at the Promontory Summit on May 10th, 2019, and I can say that all speakers honored and recognized the Chinese railroad workers. Our Secretary of Transportation delivered the keynote speech and honored all workers, the Chinese, the Irish, the Italian, the American Indian, and the Mormons. So on May 10th of this year, at the 150th anniversary, the story arc of the Chinese railroad worker was finally completed. Now, for the story arc of the Chinese-American World War II veterans. The story arc begins with the situation defining Chinese in America and Chinese Americans in the United States at the start of World War II. The total population of Chinese and Chinese Americans, to include the territory of Hawaii, was a little over 110, or about 100,000. They were largely in major cities, mostly in the Chinatowns. Some were in the rural areas. For the most part, they were isolated and largely interacted only among themselves. Of the 100,000 plus population, about 20,000 volunteered or were drafted. And that's a high percentage. They volunteered and they were drafted in spite of the Chinese Exclusion Act that was still in place and not repealed until December of 1943. They served in every theater of war, in every branch of service. They were predominantly integrated into the United States Armed Forces, not in segregated units as were the Japanese Americans and the African Americans in World War II. The only all Chinese American units were the 14th Air Service Group and the 987th Signal Company. While there were Chinese Americans that were awarded every type of award for valor, up to the Medal of Honor, the basis of award for the Congressional Medal of Honor was not for valor or for bravery, but the basis was because They volunteered and they served in spite of what might be called the legalized discrimination of the Chinese Exclusion Act. A direct quote from the public law that was enacted for the Congressional Gold Medal for Chinese Americans said, "They demonstrated highly uncommon and commendable sense of patriotism and honor in face of discrimination. They were proud to serve as Americans, and they served with pride." So, what did these Chinese American veterans of World War II do? Number one, they made known to the American public who Chinese Americans were and their abilities. Number two, they demonstrated their skills, their competencies, loyalty, and patriotism. Number three, they paved the way for future generations to serve in the United States Armed Forces. They opened up opportunities for all Asian and Chinese Americans to be in mainstream America post-World War II. And they continued the legacy of progress of Chinese Americans in the United States and enabled the follow-on generations to live the American dream. We can say that the award of the Congressional Gold Medal to Chinese American veterans finally gives honor and recognition to Chinese American veterans, and this would complete the arc of Chinese American veterans World War II. Now, with the honoring of the Chinese railroad workers, the Chinese American veterans of World War II, we must look to the future. At the Golden Spike Conference in May, I was a guest speaker, and I offered a vision to the descendants of the Chinese railroad workers. I arbitrarily set a time frame of 50 years. So that would be 50 years from May of 2019. And I really posed the issue of, wouldn't it be nice if a speaker at the 200th anniversary could say, only in America could a descendant of a Chinese railroad worker become the President of the United States. We now need to build upon the legacy and look at what you in the younger generation can do. There have been significant, there have been significant achievements by Chinese and Asian American Pacific Islanders, like many of you, who are immigrants or descendants of immigrants. In fact, we are all immigrants and descendants of immigrants. And there have been significant impacts made in each wave of immigration by Asians, by Chinese, Asian Pacific American Islanders in their immigration to the United States. There has been an ascendancy of Asian Pacific American Pacific Islanders to be members of Congress, cabinet members, U.S. ambassadors, generals, admirals, Nobel Peace Prize winners, governors, mayors, judges, academia, architects, artists, musicians, CEOs, lawyers, doctors, and dentists. But let me pause here and ask the audience, how many of you have a spouse or significant other that likes to critique your work? Any show of hands? Well, I can assure you that my wife likes to do that. So what she has said is, when I talk about Chinese Americans or Asian Americans, I'm too limiting. When we talk about deeds and accomplishments, we are all Americans. And so we should be talking about deeds and accomplishments of Americans. Now, all of you probably have heard of the name IMK, right? In fact, IMK is a fraternity member of this FF fraternity. But he passed away earlier this year. And newspapers like the New York Times and the Boston Globe wrote about him. And what did they say? They said that IMK is the most prominent American architect of his generation. You know, they did not say he was a Chinese American architect and he was a prominent Chinese, but he was the most prominent American architect of his generation. So, for all of you in the younger generation, I'd like to pose for you a vision that you can strive for. Now, while you can say in whatever you do that you are a prominent Chinese American in such and such a field, what you should do is create the vision and the objective that you be the most prominent American and fill in the blank in your generation. And so, IMK certainly accomplished that, and that could be a vision and objective for all of you in the younger generation. Thank you very much.